Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. Today, we are continuing on and finishing up our series on the decade of tragedy in Dryden, New York. And as a heads up, there will be a few cases that I have skipped over in this series, as I have spoken with family members and they've asked me that I not talk about their loved ones' stories on YouTube, and I have to respect that because, at the beginning of this series, I specifically said I wasn't trying to re-traumatize anyone in making this. I wanted to shine a light. I want to tell these stories, but not at the cost of someone's mental well-being or peace. So obviously that's the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do, and it is absolutely fine. And in today's video, we will be focusing on 6 young people who at the time of their deaths were all either current students at or recent graduates of Dryden High School. Between 1995 and 1999, these 6 young people lost their lives. All the deaths were unexpected, and each one hit the staff and students at the high school like a ton of bricks, leaving them forever changed. But before we dive in, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, GlassesUSA.com. By cutting out the middleman, GlassesUSA.com offers prescription glasses and sunglasses at up to 70% off retail prices. You can shop for all your eyewear needs online at affordable prices without leaving the comfort of your own home. I know it might sound a little scary shopping for glasses online because, they become such a big part of your daily look and you want to make sure that they look good on your face, but GlassesUSA.com has several tools on their website to make sure that you find the perfect pair of glasses for your needs and your style and your life. There's the virtual try-on tool where all you have to do is take a picture of yourself or upload a picture of yourself, and then you can spend hours trying on different frames to see which ones look great on that cute face of yours. I spend hours doing it. I have to admit that sometimes I like to pour myself a glass of wine on a Friday night and just sit at my computer trying on all these different frames. Sometimes, usually just for fun. Obviously, I have a lot of glasses already, but I still like to check them out. And I so prefer it to having to go into a glasses store and try on a bunch of frames that I don't know who just put them on and who tried them on and who's been touching them, and ugh. They also have a prescription scanner app that you can use to scan your current glasses to help you figure out what your prescription is. It's easy, it's free, and it takes under 10 minutes, so you can get all that boring administrative stuff out of the way and get right to the fun part, which is using the virtual try-on tool to find your perfect pair or pairs of glasses. GlassesUSA.com offers over 9,000 styles of eyeglasses and sunglasses, including in-house brands like Amelia E. Right now, I'm wearing the Amelia E. Pams in purple. I love the color. I love the detail on the side. And they also have these frames in black and tortoise if purple isn't your thing, which purple should be everyone's thing. Another in-house brand that I love is Muse. Like these Muse hoppers in tortoise. They have this great low-key oversized look that I love. But GlassesUSA.com also has designer brands like Ray-Ban, Oakley, Armani, Gucci, and many more. These are the Ray-Ban Clubmasters in gray, clear, and silver, which is actually a color that is exclusive to GlassesUSA.com. You can really find every conceivable style and color, as well as specialty glasses like sports glasses, safety glasses, glasses for kids. All my kids get their glasses from GlassesUSA.com, and almost all pairs can be ordered with your prescription and blue light blocking coating as well if you spend a lot of time in front of the computer like I do. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by the amount of choices that's on GlassesUSA.com, which I get, they have a ton of frames, they also have a quiz. It only takes a minute, and it will suggest the right pair of glasses based on your face shape and needs. And best of all, a complete pair of eyeglasses or sunglasses starts at only $30. Basic prescription lenses are included with every frame, including premium brands like Ray-Ban. And if you do not absolutely love your new pair of glasses, they offer free shipping and returns, including a 100% money-back guarantee within 14 days of delivery. No questions asked. They do have an excellent customer service team over there at GlassesUSA.com. So if you're looking to get a new pair of glasses or sunglasses, because, 'Tis the season. You should always be wearing sunglasses if it's sunny outside. And if you wear glasses, you should have prescription sunglasses. Well, all you have to do is check out the description box. I've linked all the frames I've talked about in this video. You can go see what they have for yourself. Try a bunch on. Pour yourself a glass of wine. Thank you so much to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring today's video. And let's dive in. So our story today starts with 19-year-old Billy Pace, a handsome and athletic young man with a mop of red hair who was enjoying his first summer after graduating from high school when he was tragically killed in a car crash on August 30th, 1995. Billy had been sitting in the back seat of a car when the driver rounded a curve in Dryden, New York too quickly, went off the road and through a stand of trees before slamming into a highway signpost. Of course, the unexpected loss of someone so young, so full of life, it was stunningly sad, and the community gathered to mourn Billy and to remember his short life in what his uncle called the best-attended funeral in Dryden history. It seemed as if the person who was impacted the most by the death of Billy Pace, however, was his younger brother, 17-year-old Scott Pace, who obviously felt lost and alone after losing his big brother and his best friend. And the Dryden Purple Lions were concerned that they were going to lose one of their most valuable players and the unofficial leader of their team, because Scott was so wrecked in the wake of Billy's death that many expected he wouldn't really recover anytime soon. However, Scott had no intention of abandoning his teammates on the football team, who he considered to be family, and when he arrived at the next practice in street clothes, wanting to check in with the team, he was moved to tears when the other players stood on the field and began applauding him. Scott was only 17, but the other players respected him, they looked up to him, and they admired his strength in the face of unimaginable pain. But no one knew that just a year later, Scott would also be gone for good, and his parents, Mark and Janice Pace, who had just buried one son, would have to do it all over again. On September 10th, 1996, Scott caught a ride home from football practice with 18-year-old Kelly Bowles. Also in the car was Scott's girlfriend, Heather Mix. They were only a half a mile away from the Pace home when a truck, backing out of a driveway on Etna Road, slammed right into their vehicle. Heather had to be airlifted to a nearby hospital, and Scott Pace didn't make it. Dryden School District Superintendent Donald Trombley reported that the school was fielding dozens of phone calls from concerned parents who could not possibly grasp how this much pain could be placed at the doorstep of one family. And he said, quote, "It's a parent's worst nightmare. They are absolutely flabbergasted. They're just not comprehending that this could happen to the same family twice. How do we even talk about it?" End quote. The Pace family could not endure another massive funeral, so they kept Scott's services private and small, but they did hold a memorial for their sons during which Billy and Scott's mother, Janice, spoke about how the last year had been absolute hell for Scott because he'd been missing his brother so much, and he had told her that he would give his own life to bring Billy back. Janice also read some poetry that Scott had written after losing his brother, where he talked about the sound of Billy's voice as they spent hours talking before going to sleep at night. He talked about the unusual red color of his brother's hair, and Scott also wrote about feeling left behind after Billy died, and he'd written, quote, "Let me feel the rain, let it release my pain," end quote. The day of Scott's funeral, the sky turned cloudy and gray and released a downpour of cold autumn rain on the town of Dryden. Janice Pace thanked the community and especially the students of Dryden High School for their love and support during a time of terrible pain for the Pace family. She said she thought of her son's friends, teammates, and classmates as her own children, and she asked that everyone think of Scott when it rained. During the memorial, two 16-year-old girls sat side by side, clutching each other's hands. Sarah Hadjany and Jennifer Bolduc were both cheerleaders on the Dryden High School varsity cheer team, and they'd been best friends since childhood when they both attended Girl Scouts and baton lessons together. And everyone in Dryden said if you had a daughter, You would want her to be exactly like Sarah and Jennifer. They were good girls, good students, and extremely responsible for their ages. Besides being active in school sports like cheer and track, the girls both held part-time jobs. Sarah worked at Clark's Food Mart after school and on weekends, and Jennifer worked across the street at the Purple Lion ice cream shop. They both helped coach the Dryden youth cheerleading squad, and Sarah, who wanted to eventually work as a physical therapist, she tutored younger kids in the special education program. Jennifer also gave back, volunteering at the Cortland Memorial Hospital and hoping to one day work in the medical field herself. They had so much going on, so much going for them, so much to look forward to. Sarah had just seen her favorite singer, Alanis Morissette, in concert, and both Sarah and Jennifer had recently gotten their driver's licenses, and they were looking forward to, becoming more independent. At school, both the girls were incredibly popular with the younger crowd who looked up to them because at this time, cheerleaders at Dryden High School were like celebrities. Sarah and Jennifer were also popular with their peers because, yes, they were beautiful and talented, but they were also kind and friendly to everyone. Sarah and Jennifer were not the stereotypical stuck-up cheerleaders you see in teen movies. They were full of love and light, and they had a smile and a sweet compliment for everyone they encountered, and it was said that if you asked all of their friends to stand side by side, that line would stretch for a mile. They were just happy, normal teenage girls, going through their junior year of high school, enjoying being young and carefree, and not knowing the terrible fate that was ahead of them. On Friday, October 4th, 1996, Sarah and Jennifer did not show up to school, which was unusual, especially because it was a day where they would be cheering at a football game, and it wasn't just any football game, it was their homecoming game. And one of the requirements for participating was attendance at school the day of. At first, their friends on the cheer team thought the girls were maybe just running a little late to school because maybe they'd stayed up too late the night before. Sarah's parents were out of town. They were taking a little weekend vacation in Maine, and Jennifer had spent the night at Sarah's house so that Sarah wouldn't be alone. It also turned out that a male classmate had stayed the night with the girls, so they'd be less scared, but he had left Sarah's house to go to school at 7 a.m. that morning. No one thought that Sarah and Jennifer would just not show up the whole day, and everyone figured they would appear for the game with some hysterical story about why they'd missed school and apologies and smiles and laughs. But that evening, Jennifer's father, Ron, he called the home of Captain William Foley of the New York State Police. Now, Foley wasn't home at that moment because he was dropping his own kids off at the Dryden High School football game. But Ron Bolduc was concerned because he could not find his 16-year-old daughter, Jennifer, who had missed school that day after spending the night with her best friend. And he decided to seek the help of his friend, who also happened to be a law enforcement official. When Foley got home, he called Ron Bolduc back. Later, Foley would say, quote, "Ron Bolduc calls me because he's concerned. He's not going to get the appropriate response from the state police. A missing 16-year-old girl? This happens all the time. So I called Mr. Bolduc back and said I will look into it. And what I do is I ask that a fellow by the name of Investigator Bill Bean be sent. Now, this is unusual for us to send an investigator for a missing girl. We'd normally send a uniformed trooper who'd assess the situation, but in this case, as a favor to Mr. Bolduc, Investigator Bean is the first to arrive at the Hadjany residence, and he quickly determined there's cause for concern." End quote. The police would later report that there was no sign of forced entry at 42 Church Street in McLean, New York. But inside the house, there were clear signs of a struggle. In the bathroom, the shower curtain and the rod had been pulled down, and the soap dish in the shower had been broken off the wall. Both Sarah and Jennifer's cheer uniforms appeared to have just been newly washed, and they'd been laid out to dry. Jennifer's was found hanging on a towel rack, and Sarah's was in the basement on a drying rack. These would have been the clothes the girls would have put on that morning since it was a game day. But Sarah and Jennifer were nowhere to be found. The authorities alerted Sarah's parents, who quickly returned from Maine, only to find that their vehicle, a 1992 gray Chevy Lumina, was also missing from their garage. Police quickly located the car around 10 p.m. that same night, It was found in the parking lot of the Cortland Line Company, a fishing line manufacturing plant located on Kellogg Road near the southeast end of the city line and 7 miles away from Sarah's house. Law enforcement immediately forced open the trunk, fearing the worst, that the bodies of 2 teenage girls would be found inside. Sarah and Jennifer were not in the trunk, but inside the trunk and inside the rest of the vehicle, investigators discovered blood and other evidence that told them someone had taken the 2 girls by force, and most likely had taken their lives as well. Another alarming discovery was that some of the blood appeared to be made with fingerprints, prints that were in a small diamond-shaped pattern, suggesting the attacker had been wearing gloves, and that this attack had been carefully planned and calculated, not spur of the moment. The inside of the vehicle had also been saturated with some kind of oil, and the police believed that this had happened so that evidence inside could be destroyed or covered up. So the police interviewed employees at the fishing line company, and a lot of them remembered seeing something odd in their parking lot around 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon. It just so happened that the cafeteria, where many of the employees spent their lunch break, it overlooked the parking lot, and they'd seen a man wearing elbow-length yellow rubber gloves walking away from the Chevy Lumina and then down Kellogg Road. All the employees gave a similar description of this man. He was between 40 and 45 years of age, stocky, with a noticeable belly and a tuft of dark hair in front of a receding hairline. He stood between 5'7" and 5'10", and he'd been wearing a dark shirt and pants. What the public didn't know at that time was there was another report of blood being found in a rustic one-room hunting cabin in the woods of Otselic, New York, 40 miles away from the house on Church Street where Sarah and Jennifer had last been seen alive on Friday morning. The cabin belonged to a man named Bruno Couture, and he had given his friend Marcus Hutchian permission to use it that weekend. Now, this is a very, very rustic cabin. There's no electricity. It's one room. It's basically just a place to go if you want to hunt. Maybe you crash there for the night so you can get up early and get out into the woods early. Maybe you can, store your hunting equipment and stuff there. Very, very rustic, not the place you would go for like a luxury, relaxing vacation. So Marcus claimed that on Friday night, he'd arrived at this remote cabin after dark. But like I said, there's no electricity. So he wasn't sure what the puddle on the floor was. He walks in, he sees like what appears to be a drying liquid in a puddle on the floor. Now, a friend that he was with, he followed Marcus in and shined his flashlight on the floor. Both Marcus and his friend agreed that they thought the dark puddle looked like blood. So they called Bruno and they asked him what they should do. Bruno decided it would be best if he checked it out himself. So he and his fiancée Anne drove to Otselic. When they saw what Marcus had been concerned about, they immediately called the state police. Now, when the state trooper arrived, he began asking Bruno and Anne very specific questions, like, did they know anyone who lived in McLean, New York? Did they know anyone who lived on Church Street in McLean? And if anyone had used their cabin recently? And Bruno's fiancée, Anne, responded that her brother, John Andrews, he did live on Church Street in McLean. And he'd been at the hunting cabin at least twice in the past few years. In fact, he and his wife and 6-year-old son had just used it this past summer. Later, Anne remembered the immediate reaction from the state trooper, and she said, quote, "The trooper flies by me so quickly he almost knocks me down. He runs into the camp and starts screaming for the senior investigator, and at that point, I just wanted to vomit, because my gut instinct was right. I love him, but the kidnapper is my brother, John." End quote. So when Anne was telling this story to the paper later, she kind of made it seem like as these questions were being asked, she already knew what the answers were going to be. She already knew that it was in connection to what had happened to Sarah and Jennifer, because Anne happened to work with Jennifer's mother at the hospital. So she was aware that these 2 girls were missing. Now there's blood found in the cabin. Now the police are asking questions about Church Street, McLean, who's been using the cabin. And she kind of had an idea of where it was going. And she knew that it was going to lead back to her brother, John. And she said at one point, she kind of exchanged glances with her fiancé, Bruno, and there was like this silent understanding between them that they both knew what was happening and that it was just time to come clean. Like there was going to be no protecting of her brother in this moment. And I want to take a moment and recognize how difficult that was, because we have talked a lot in a lot of cases about how family members will cover things up and protect their loved ones. Maybe not forever, but initially, I guess that's your first instinct sometimes, right? And so it must have been incredibly difficult for Anne knowing, this is her brother. He's probably involved with this, and I'm going to point the police right in his direction. The following Monday morning, community members received freshly printed flyers with the faces of Sarah Hadjny and Jennifer Bolduc on them, but they'd barely started handing these flyers out and putting them up before the police held a press conference, announcing that they had found physical evidence which led them to believe the two missing girls had been taken and they were no longer alive. Earlier that day, before everyone else knew what had happened, Dryden High School officials delivered the news to the student body because the police had wanted them to hear it from the adults they trusted instead of on the news. 16-year-old Fred Gilbert, a junior who had been close to both of the girls, remembered the moment that he found out, saying, quote, "My teacher came in to read this note about it, and she was crying really hard. After I heard it, I cried too." End quote. The students had been instructed to stay calm and stay in their classrooms, but immediately after the prepared statement had been read aloud by teachers and administrators, some of the students began screaming, sobbing, throwing things, and students and faculty members streamed into the hallways, sobbing and clutching onto each other for support. Classes were canceled for the remainder of the day, and 10th grader Dan Darling said, quote, "It just makes you so sad because everyone is sitting around and crying. I just wanted to get out of there." End quote. Donald Trombley, the superintendent, was at a loss, saying, quote, "We have an extremely torn up high school right now. The tragedy that has befallen this school district is immense. I don't know how our students, who have been so emotionally wounded by the tragedies over the last 3.5 years, are going to cope with this. It's almost surreal." End quote. And he's specifically speaking about, obviously, what happened to the Pace brothers, but also shortly before Billy Pace died, the Dryden High School football team had lost their football coach. He had been murdered. So they were sort of trying to recover from that when Billy died, and then they were trying to recover from that when Scott died, and then they were trying to recover from that when this happened to Jennifer and Sarah. So it was like one thing after the other, with no time to really catch your bearings between each tragic incident. Also on Monday morning, 31-year-old John Benjamin Andrews was approached by police officers as he left the night shift at Paul Trinity Microchipped Corporation in Cortland, New York, and he worked there as a computerized lathe operator. Now, he initially refused to speak to the police, and he asked for a lawyer, at which point he was arrested and brought into the police station for an interview. John Andrews lived at 38 Church Street, right next door to the Hadjny family, and he and his wife Patricia and their 6-year-old son had been living there since 1994, but they mostly kept to themselves. Now, Andrews told law enforcement that he'd been home all day Friday, October 4th, but they had already spoken to his sister Anne, who had been the one to point them in his direction. Anne had not only told the police that her brother John had used the hunting cabin, she had not only told them that he lived on Church Street, the same street as one of the victims, she'd also told them that on the afternoon of Friday, October 4th, around 3 p.m., her brother had shown up at her house, which was located just a mile from where the Hadjny's Chevy Lumina had been abandoned in the parking lot of the Cortland Line Company. Anne claimed that John was walking, he was covered in oil, and he told her he'd been working on his car all day before asking her for a ride to his house. Now, this house, where John Andrews lived with his wife and son, it was connected to Sarah Hadjny. In 2009, when Sarah and her friend Jennifer vanished, Sarah had been living right next door to John Andrews, but she had grown up in the house that John Andrews now occupied. Sarah's parents, John and Sandra, had owned the house from 1980 to 1990, but they'd moved to Hartford when Sarah was 10 years old. However, in August of 1999, the Hadjny family returned to Church Street, and they bought John Hadjny's parents' house at 42 Church Street, which was right next door to their old home. And although John Andrews and his family had been living on Church Street for a few years, like I said, they pretty much had kept to themselves. and they didn't really socialize with their neighbors, including Sarah's family. George Totman, who lived across the street from the Andrews, he said he never even knew the man's first name, which was not common when living in such a small town. Totman said, quote, "If you live in a community for a year and no one knows you, it tells you what sort of person they are," end quote. Damn, I wonder what my neighbors think about me. I wonder, because I've been living in this area now for going on 2 years. Ain't nobody knows me, and I don't know anybody, and I like it that way. So I wonder if they're thinking this about me. I mean, it was a different time, right? This is like 1999. It wasn't that long ago, but it was a different time. Also, a super small town. I think it's more common now for people to keep to themselves and not talk to their neighbors. Just agree with me and make me feel better about myself. Because if anything ever happens and I'm accused of something, the neighbors are going to have a field day. So when Sarah and Jennifer had gone missing, all of their friends and neighbors, especially on Church Street, they'd reached out to their parents to see if there was anything they could do and to offer their support, except for the Andrews family, who had stayed inside their house as everyone else was out searching and handing out flyers. And when the residents of Church Street were asked to place a burning candle in their windows to keep the hope alive for the missing girls, to show a sign of solidarity, the Andrews windows were dark and candleless. After John Andrews was in custody, the police announced that they believed he'd entered the unlocked home of Sarah around 8 a.m. on Friday morning. Now remember, Sarah lives right next door to him. And he must have entered around the same time that Sarah and Jennifer were in the bathroom, busy getting ready for school. He took them by surprise. There was a struggle, and he was able to get them into the Chevy Lumina that belonged to Sarah's parents before driving them to Ottselic, New York, in Chenango County, where he sexually abused them, tortured them, murdered them, and then dismembered their bodies, disposing of body parts in several locations stretching over 4 miles. Now, it appeared that some sort of violent encounter had happened at Bruno Couture's cabin, which sat on 29 acres of land and included an L-shaped pond that he had dug a few years prior. A bewildered Bruno would later say, quote, "I don't know why he picked the cabin. If he was standing here in front of me, I'd like to ask him," end quote. I know why, because it's a one-room, electricity-free cabin in the middle of nowhere. That's why, Bruno. And obviously, any time a life is taken, it's devastating. But to have 2 young lives taken in such an absolutely violent and horrific way, it was really more than anyone could bear at that moment. At a memorial for the girls, their classmates and teachers tried to focus on how Sarah and Jennifer had lived instead of how they had died. 2,000 people gathered in the Dryden High School gym and waited their turn to look at pictures of the 2 friends, dressed up for school dances, posing in their cheerleading uniforms, blowing out candles on their birthday cakes. Adam Barsh, a senior, said, quote, "They were 2 of the most beautiful people from this school. I've been so sad. I don't know what to do," end quote. Social studies teacher Joseph Mack told stories of how friendly and considerate both girls had been. He had said Sarah would sometimes be late to his class, and when he would ask her why she was late, she would say, "Mr. Mack, there's just so many people to talk to." Joseph Mack said, quote, "That was Sarah, too many friends and not enough time," end quote. And Jennifer, she would always check in with Mac, her social studies teacher, and ask him how he was doing throughout the day. One day, he said she asked him how he was doing 3 times in 3 hours, and when he pointed this out to her, Jennifer told him, well, maybe things have changed in the last 3 hours. John Hayes, the reverend from the church both girls and their families attended, he addressed the gathering crowd and said, quote, "With the loss of Jennifer and Sarah, the sense of innocence and safety living in a small town has been taken from us. Why did this happen? We ask it in anger and pain, in despair and frustration. Why did God let this happen? I don't believe anyone will ever have the answer to the why." End quote. A line from the movie It's a Wonderful Life was also read, the one where the little girl, she announces that every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings, and some in the crowd solemnly held up bells and rang them. The gruesome work of recovering the remains of Sarah and Jennifer began. State police barricaded off a thickly wooded area bordered by 4 different roads: Graham Road, Gray Road, Oakley Road, and Rhett Road. and law enforcement, along with scent dogs and their handlers, could be seen periodically emerging from the thick foliage to consult a map and plan their next move. They combed the acreage around Bruno Couture's cabin and dredged the pond on the property, and they began recovering body parts. It was believed that John Andrews had pulled over at different areas to dispose of some of the body parts deep into the forest and then simply tossed others out the window as he drove. Now, John Andrews, when he was arrested, he had been charged with kidnapping, but he had not been charged with murder yet because the authorities, they still hadn't figured out exactly where Sarah and Jennifer had been killed or exactly how, and Andrews was not cooperating at all. Tompkins County District Attorney George Dentz, who you'll remember from our past 2 videos on Dryden, New York, he announced that charging Andrews with kidnapping, which was a Class A felony, that would at least keep him behind bars without bail while the police continued investigating. The crime scene covered a 3-county area, Tompkins, Cortland, and Chenango, and the respective district attorneys in these counties would still have to discuss whose jurisdiction the crime fell under. It was later decided that Tompkins County and the DA George Dentz would be the ones to handle any murder charges brought against John Andrews. And although everyone wanted to begin healing after the string of senseless loss that had hit them, it was really going to be a long road. The school offered counseling, hoping to catch early signs of depression or suicidal thoughts before it was too late. Chris Bertelson, the post-vention coordinator at the Suicide Prevention and Crisis Center, said, quote, "It's crucial that people turn to each other and take advantage of counseling. What we as an agency are most concerned about, particularly for the kids, is that people would have a sense of meaningless. The kids just start drifting. Debriefing helps prevent that. It helps get one's feet back on the ground," end quote. And I'm talking about this because it will become important later. I mean, it's important in general. She's absolutely right. It's important to intervene very quickly after a traumatic event like this, especially with young kids. And psychological debriefing is a formal version of providing emotional and psychological support immediately following a traumatic event. Now, the goal is to prevent the development of PTSD and other negative effects. Most psychological debriefing interventions include a single session, which might last 1 to 3 hours in the days immediately following a traumatic event. It's also called critical incident stress debriefing, and it's really just intended to provide a bridge from the traumatic event to hope, healing, and recovery by giving the survivor a voice and offering them closure, hopefully allowing them to live with a restored sense of security and overall well-being. But if you think about it, a lot of these kids, they were so young, too young to fully wrap their heads around all that was happening, all that had happened. And they were not only devastated and terrified themselves, right, but their parents, their trusted adults, their teachers. They were also grappling with all of these feelings, and even if the adults didn't verbalize their fears, their emotions, in an effort to protect the children, the kids are still going to pick up on it. And it wasn't just affecting Dryden, but surrounding areas as well, especially in the counties where searches for Sarah and Jennifer's remains were happening every single day. The Georgetown Fire Station had become the makeshift command center for the searches, and every morning students who attended an Otselic Valley Elementary School were driven by this fire station on their way to school, and they would gaze out the windows of their school buses at the lines of police cars and CSI vans. Before these young children were sent home for a 4-day weekend, school officials and state troopers called an assembly to try and calm their nerves, and the kids were asked to raise their hands if they were scared. Mike Rotondi, their principal, said, quote, "There were many, many, many hands," end quote. A class at Georgetown High School reached out to their neighboring town, writing a letter specifically for the students and staff at Dryden High School, and that letter said, quote, "The bewilderment of this horrific act is an awakening that shows that senseless violence can hit so close to home. It is odd that a brutal act such as this can tear communities apart and yet in a way bring them together. In grieving the loss of Sarah Ann Hageney and Jennifer Lynn Bolduc, our communities offer to yours open arms and hearts," end quote. And this is very moving, right? Because these are high school kids who are behaving in a very mature, compassionate, empathetic way. High school kids, teenagers, are often known for being incredibly self-centered, incredibly, selfish and focused inward, which they should be. That's part of their development. So to hear that these kids were able to come together to offer such beautiful words of support to, strangers pretty much, people that they just knew were going through it and needed a helping hand, needed to hear something beautiful and warm and kind. It's very moving, and it does show that these tragedies happen, right? And they have horrific ripple effects, but they also can bring out the good in people and in humanity. But in Dryden, the tension was palpable. Local reporter Dick Case said, quote, "This hits close to home. People say that about the tragedy in Dryden. The horror comes inside our homes and our hearts," end quote. A Dryden man who lived on a farm with no close-by neighbors told Case that he had purchased his first gun after the Harris family had been murdered, saying, quote, "No one knew how horribly they had died. Just then, their killer remained out there, a frightful phantom we all saw and didn't see at the same time," end quote. After Sarah and Jennifer had become victims, the man announced that he was now going to teach his own teenage daughter how to use and handle the gun. Another woman in Syracuse claimed that the terrible events which had happened in Dryden over the past 6 years were not random at all, but a clear sign that the town was under the hold of some satanic influence. And I wonder if this is where the rumors of the supernatural and curses started, because that's really the first time I read it in a newspaper article where there was some semblance of a supernatural element. And a social worker named Mary Lou angrily demanded that men march against violence towards women, saying, quote, "This isn't a tragedy, it's an outrage, and it happens every week in our community. The hideous attacks on women and female children. What the hell is going on here? Do we read about women raping and cutting up men? Every man in central New York ought to be out marching," end quote. The week following John Andrews' arrest brought with it more information about the crime and the man who was believed to have committed it. Dr. James Terzian, a forensic pathologist who was working on the case, he said he believed that Andrews had used multiple instruments to dismember the bodies of Sarah and Jennifer, stating, quote, "The manner of death is homicide by violent means. We don't know how they were killed, and we may never know," end quote. Because, if you think about it, their bodies were cut up, right? So it would be very difficult to figure out exactly what the cause of death was. Some background on John Andrews also made its way to the papers, and it was a little shocking. He'd been a sergeant in the United States Air Force in 1991 when he'd been convicted in a military court of housebreaking, burglary, and aggravated assault. Andrews and his wife were living on a base outside of Bitburg, Germany, when he forced himself into the apartment of another woman who happened to be the wife of another airman. And this couple were actually friends with Andrews and his wife, Patricia. Now, the woman claimed that one night she'd heard a knock on her door, and when she looked through the peephole, she didn't see anyone, so she opened the door. And that's when she found John Andrews wearing a ski mask. He forced her back into the apartment with what she believed was an intent to sexually assault her. Andrews' attack escalated when the woman bit his thumb, and this caused him to hit her on the head with a chrome dumbbell that he had with him 3 times. As he was making his getaway, the woman, who thankfully survived, she grabbed the back of his ski mask, unmasking him and identifying him to police. Investigators would later find the dumbbell in John Andrews' apartment with traces of the woman's hair, skin, and blood still on it, and he was sentenced to 5 years at Fort Leavenworth, a maximum security military prison. He remained there from July of 1991 to December of 1994, and upon his release, he was dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. 3 months later, John Andrews and his family bought the house on Church Street, right next to Sarah Hajny. But here's the thing, law enforcement could figure out no motive. They'd been unable to figure out any interaction that John Andrews might have had with Sarah or her family. Andrews kept to himself. He wasn't super friendly. He wasn't neighborly. And they don't really come out right and say this, but I'm sure that the police talked to Sarah's parents and they were like, "Hey, has this guy ever talked to you? Is he hanging around? Does he seem overly interested in Sarah?" Et cetera, et cetera. And they most likely said, no, we don't talk to him. We don't know him. We haven't really had any interaction with him. So it was sort of theorized that maybe John Andrews had become obsessed with the young girl, sort of like watching her from afar, waiting for his chance to get closer, and he had taken that chance to grab her when her parents were out of town. Now, he may not even have known that Jennifer was staying the night at Sarah's house when he crept in early that Friday morning. So he was either alarmed by this or he felt like, bonus girl. Either way, he took them both. He hurt them both, and he killed them both. And now knowing that this man had a violent past, he had a history of hurting women, he'd been to prison for it, he'd been dishonorably discharged because of it, it sort of gave people an answer of some kind, right? They still didn't know exactly why. They couldn't figure out an exact motive. John Andrews himself wasn't talking, but at least it gave people some sort of closure in a way to know that this is just a violent guy who hurts women, who's done it before, and who did it again. But not everyone was pleased with all of this information being released to the public. On October 18th, John Andrews' attorneys, James Baker and William Easton, accused the police and other officials of leaking information to the media and making prejudicial statements about their client. The lawyers said, quote, "The enormous dread experienced by the community has been amplified by unfounded speculation about the case, as well as prejudicial leaks from named and unnamed public officials," end quote. So the attorneys were referring to several items that had been published in the papers, like John Andrews' mugshot and his criminal record, as well as comments from the police that he could have potentially been a stalker or even a serial killer. Now, to be fair, the lawyers said that the police said he was a stalker or a serial killer. I did read articles where the police had suggested that he may have been watching Sarah, that he may have been stalking her, kind of following her movements, figuring out when he could strike. But I did not ever see any mention of the police kind of speculating or commenting that he may have been a serial killer. However, I will say it's not like a crazy thing to speculate about, right? He did this to this woman in 1991. Now he does it again to two young girls. Is it crazy to think that this guy may have been behaving violently all of his life and he just got caught these two times? But anyways, the attorneys Baker and Easton, they requested a gag order, claiming that at this point, their client could be facing the death penalty, and the news coverage was hurting his chances of finding a fair and impartial jury. And District Attorney George Dentz said that no leaks had come from his office, and he was vehemently opposed to the gag order. And Judge William Barrett agreed, ruling that the order was unnecessary since there were enough rules in place to govern information released by the press and to the press. And thus far, they hadn't printed anything that was untrue. On October 25th, the papers printed that the state police had recovered more evidence after completing searches at John Andrews' home, vehicle, and boat. From his house, they had recovered yellow rubber gloves, 2 axes in leather cases, a pair of military goggles that were designed to protect the wearer from sun, dust, and wind, a t-shirt and a towel that appeared to be stained with blood, 5 pairs of sneakers that they wanted to compare to shoe prints found at certain areas where remains had been found, a chip of wood that appeared to be stained with blood, ashes from his furnace that may have been evidence Andrew had tried to destroy by burning it, a trash barrel, a chainsaw, motor oil, and rolls of black, gray, green, and red duct tape. In his garage and yard, police found a 3rd axe, more duct tape, and another pair of gloves, as well as additional clothing. In John Andrews' 1989 Chevy Celebrity, a canister of pepper spray was recovered along with a hammer, a light blue bedspread, wire, a blue gym bag, a green backpack, and a map drawn on a yellow legal pad. Now, in the warrant for the vehicle, the police had specifically stated that they were looking for a map that would be hand-drawn and show the geographical area of Tompkins County, Cortland County, and Chenango County, and that was exactly what they found. They also got a court order requiring John Andrews to provide them with hair samples as well as scrapings from underneath his fingernails. So let's go over this a little bit because this case is never going to go to trial and we're going to find out why. So we're never really going to hear legitimately from the police or during the trial what all this evidence means. But let's look at the evidence and sort of ask ourselves that question because you've got 2 young girls here, so the media is not going to print all these details. The police probably aren't even going to give the media all these details, but they're finding axes, they're taking chainsaws, gloves, duct tape, pepper spray, a blue bedspread, wire, things like that. What it appears happened is John Andrews most likely had that pepper spray or mace. They refer to it as pepper spray or mace, even though I believe those two things are a little bit different, but he probably had that when he entered the house. He probably sprayed them to, make sure that they couldn't see, that they couldn't fight back, because he is going to have to restrain 2 girls at this point instead of 1, unless he knew that 2 would be there and he came prepared. And then he's got all of these rolls of duct tape, which means he most likely tied them up and restrained them before bringing them through the house, into the garage, and then into the car of Sarah's family members. You've got a light blue bedspread. Maybe that was used to cover them up while he drove so that they wouldn't be spotted from the road. You've also got wire, maybe also likely restraining them while they're in the car so they can't move, things like that. It shows that this was a very terrifying time for these 2 young girls, that they wouldn't have had much chance to fight back against somebody who came so prepared. And then you also have this hand-drawn map. Now, why would John Andrews need a hand-drawn map? I really don't know. I would assume that if he just wanted to know where he was going, he could have used a regular map. But the fact that he hand-drew a map, it makes me think that he specifically and personally wanted something on that map, such as, for instance, maybe the areas and locations where he had left body parts, because that is something that, if we're being honest here, something that serial killers do, right? They like to keep trophies. They like to keep little pieces of their crimes to remember their crimes. And he may have wanted to remember where he placed these body parts, maybe to revisit later. I don't know. It's just a theory. I can't figure out any other reason why he would have had to have hand-drawn a map when he could have just bought one at any gas station. On November 1st, all of this evidence was presented to a Tompkins County grand jury, who then indicted John Andrews on 26 counts, including kidnapping, burglary, sexual abuse, and 9 counts of first-degree murder. Now, the grand jury indictment stated that law enforcement and the prosecutors believed Andrews had tortured the girls and raped them before taking their lives, and now it would be up to District Attorney George Dents to decide whether or not he would seek the death penalty. But before that decision could even be made, just the day after the indictment was handed down, at 1:30 in the morning, John Andrews was found dead in his cell after hanging himself with his own shoelaces. Tompkins County Sheriff Emery Guest, who we also remember from 2-year-old Eliza Mae Bush's story in this previous video, he claimed that they had been keeping a continual log of Andrews' activities and demeanors, and he'd given them no reason to suspect he intended to take his own life. In fact, just the night before, just hours before they found him, he'd been playing cards with the other inmates. They'd been chatting, just having a good old time. And Andrews had obviously been on suicide watch, and he'd been placed in a cell by himself in a maximum security block of 4 cells with guards checking on him every 15 minutes. Guest said that it was the first death of an inmate in the 11-year history of the county's public safety building, stating, quote, "This building was designed to minimize the chance for an inmate to kill himself, and the clothes hooks ordinarily give way if weight is applied. Andrews managed to tie the shoelaces in a way that defeated that safety measure," end quote, because apparently Andrews had tied his shoelaces around his neck and then on the clothes hook on the door and hanged himself. So I'm just going to say it because some of us, maybe even a lot of us, may be thinking the same thing, but this gives me like heavy Jeffrey Epstein vibes, right? He was on suicide watch. We were watching him. We were checking on him every 15 minutes. I don't know how he managed this. So either they weren't checking on him as much as they claimed, or maybe there was somebody who had a hand in helping him out, helping him to fulfill this action. You've got a small town. You've got 2 young local girls. You've got, a bunch of people, a bunch of adults who have children who cannot believe that this happened to 2 young girls in their own community. You got a lot of anger and hatred. But reportedly, there was no doubt that Andrews had done this to himself because he'd left letters to relatives telling them what he planned to do. However, law enforcement would not comment on whether Andrews had confessed to the murders of Sarah and Jennifer in those letters or provided more information, such as like motive or exactly how he had done it. Andrews' attorneys also claimed they had no idea that he was going to kill himself, and when asked if they believed that their client was guilty of committing the crime he'd been accused of, William Easton responded, quote, "I think the answer to that is pretty self-evident, but you'll have to ask the state police for the details," end quote. DA George Dents said that he had briefed Andrews' attorneys on the evidence that they had in the case, and he suspected suspected that at the time of his death, John Andrews was fully apprised of the strength of the case against him, including a bloody knife that had been found with his fingerprints all over it. This had been found at the hunting cabin. George Dentz felt that Andrews knew it was all over, and he decided to take his own life rather than face the music, saying, quote, "We, who have been involved in the criminal investigation, are absolutely confident that he and he alone was responsible for the deaths of Sarah Hajny and Jennifer Bolduc," end quote. After he was gone, some of the information that law enforcement had collected and uncovered during their investigation was revealed, specifically in regards to the early life of John Benjamin Andrews. Born on July 11, 1965, John Andrews was the middle child of Louise and John Benjamin Andrews Sr. John Jr. had an older sister and a younger sister, and his father, John Andrews Sr., had served in the United States Marines between 1959 and 1974. He'd done 3 tours in Vietnam, for which he was awarded the Purple Heart. But, according to John Sr.'s brother, Kenneth, John Sr. had returned from Vietnam wounded, disabled, and changed. Kenneth said, quote, "He had a tough time over in Vietnam, and he wasn't the same when he got back," end quote. There wasn't a lot of work for someone like John Sr. in his position when he came back from, fighting in a war. And he would sometimes work as a dishwasher or take odd jobs, but money was always tight. And in 1978, he and his wife had to file for bankruptcy. And it seems like John Sr. could sometimes be physically abusive to his wife and children, and he was drinking a lot, being charged with drunk driving by the Cortland police in both 1980 and 1982. And in 1985, John Sr. was arrested on a felony charge that he had sexually assaulted a minor girl in Dryden. But despite all of this, his son, John Jr., for all intents and purposes, seemed to be largely unaffected, as far as his friends and peers could tell. John Jr. was a nice boy, a polite boy, easygoing, an all-American kind of kid who played JV football and went four-wheeling with his friends on the backcountry roads on the weekends. John Jr. loved anything to do with cars, and like most of his friends at that time, he owned a hot rod and a pickup truck, and he took auto mechanics courses at the local BOCES. In his senior yearbook, when students were asked where they saw themselves in 10 years, John Andrews Jr. had said, quote, "I will have a great family and my own company. Also, remembering the times we fooled Mr. Godfrey in the lower parking lot," end quote. But John Jr. was not particularly close to his father, whose emotional state had seemed to be deteriorating as the years went on. Neighbors remembered that John Sr. returned from Vietnam and stopped shaving or cutting his hair, and he would go out hunting every single day. A classmate of John Jr.'s said that sometimes John Jr. would talk to his mom, and he seemed to have a good relationship with her, but he stayed clear of his father. And almost as soon as John Sr. was charged with the sexual assault of a minor, John Jr. enlisted in the Navy. He married his high school sweetheart, Patricia McGorry, and a few years later, the couple were living on Aviano Air Base in Italy when John Andrews Sr. went into his bedroom, closed the door, and shot himself in the head with a shotgun, dying at the age of 46. And then, as we know, in 1991, John Andrews Jr. was imprisoned after attacking a woman and hitting her on the head with a dumbbell 3 times. When Andrews arrived back in Tompkins County after being released from prison and dishonorably discharged from the Air Force, he showed up to a company called Gallery Machines, wearing his military fatigues and asking to be interviewed for a job as a machinist. The company was owned by husband and wife Glenda and Harry Hartman, and Glenda interviewed Andrews, and she asked him why he wasn't continuing on with the military. Glenda would later tell the media, quote, "He said, kind of sheepishly, I remember his face, he said he wanted to be home with his family. The service wasn't much of a place for a family," end quote. His coworkers, who called him Andy, said he always seemed sad, and when he walked, he would keep his head down, not making eye contact unless he absolutely had to. Brian Lynn, who often shared a lunch break with Andrews, said, quote, "He didn't seem twisted or anything. He was an average kind of guy," end quote. When Andrews left the company on October 6, 1995, to take a job at the Pal Trinity Corp., where his mother had worked for over a decade, he paid Glenda and Harry Hartman $20 for a pipe wrench he had once lost while he worked for them. But during the time he worked for them, he'd never told them that he'd been in prison for assaulting a woman, nor had he ever mentioned that he'd been dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Air Force. He kind of made it seem like leaving the military was his own plan, his own idea, because he wanted to be a family guy. At his new job, where his mother Louise was well-liked and very well-respected, people said Andrews was fine. He did his job well, and then he went home. And I have to admit, the whole vibe I'm getting from John Andrews is very Gary Ridgway. For those of you who don't know, which I'm sure most of you do, Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer. And he was awful. And everyone was so stunned when they found out that he was this monster because he had been such a normal guy. You know, he was good at his job. He minded his own business. He liked to go to garage sales. He didn't cause trouble for anyone. He was polite. He would help you out if you needed it. Just a normal, average guy. And one of John Andrews' neighbors said, quote, "It seemed I was the only one around here who got to know him. He did me a favor and I did him some. He seemed very neighborly to me." End quote. No one knows what was going on behind Andrews' average guy demeanor, right? No one knows what kind of thoughts and impulses he was having, what kind of dark thoughts and dark impulses he was having, and what his actual motive was for why he did what he did to two beautiful and innocent 16-year-old girls. And honestly, I personally don't care. I don't need to know. He was clearly a monster, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was responsible for other missing women. No one decides to just kidnap two girls, torture them, and then chop them up into pieces for their first crime. That takes some graduating. That takes some trial and error. It takes some practice and planning beforehand. So I don't feel like this was his first time doing anything like this. And John's sister Anne said, quote, "What makes us do things? What makes us not do things? What pushed my brother over the edge? The police tell us it was some kind of woman hate crime because of the way the bodies were mutilated, but John idolized my mother." End quote. That doesn't necessarily matter. Because first of all, I mean, many violent criminals who go on to hurt or kill women have great relationships with their mothers, right? Some of these mothers come out and support them in the media, like we saw with Shirley King and Michael King in the first video of this series. And we also don't know what was happening behind the scenes with John Andrews and his mother. It could have seemed that he had a close relationship with her, but it could have been more of a codependent relationship. It could have been, maybe an unhealthy level of a relationship. There could have been abuse behind the scenes. He could have been angry with her for not protecting him from his father, things like that. We don't know all of the details. But what I do know is the community of Dryden, New York, they weren't really that sad to find out that John Andrews had ended his own life. Many of them had not been necessarily looking forward to a trial, worried that it would cause more emotional trauma to the families of Sarah and Jennifer, as well as cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. However, it seemed that John Andrews had, in a way, escaped true justice. He had escaped having to face the parents and loved ones of his victims and hear their words, hear their impact statements. He had escaped having to sit there and hear all the evidence that they had against him while a jury of his peers judged him. Local man Chris Wood said, quote, "I can't say I'm sorry. I have no problem with the fact he's dead. It's just like saying I'm going to take the lives of two people who did nothing wrong and just walk away from it." End quote. Another man, Bill Dahl, remarked, quote, "I'm kind of disappointed. He sort of took the easy way out. It will leave a lot of unanswered questions." End quote. Bill Dahl's fiancée, Tina Kinsman, she said they weren't really looking forward to raising their future children in the world that they now currently felt they were living in. She and Bill had loved growing up in the country where you could walk anywhere you wanted and stay out with your friends all night, where you could open your door to a stranger who would then have the possibility of becoming a friend. She said, quote, "The freedom that we had is gone. We'll keep a closer eye on our children and know where they are. You don't dare walk too far alone. It's scary." End quote. But the fear and sadness wasn't finished with Dryden just yet. One of Sarah and Jennifer's classmates and fellow cheerleaders had been planning to spend the night at Sarah's house that Thursday in October, but at the last minute plans had changed. Katie Savina had been close to both girls, but especially Sarah, who she had considered to be her best friend. When they were killed, it hit her hard. And as it did to so many in Dryden, it changed her. Before that, Katie had been very innocent and naive. She hadn't even had her first kiss yet. But when her friends died, she saw the world and life very differently. She began wearing Sarah's clothes, especially Sarah's belt, which she wore every day. And she'd often visit Sarah and Jennifer's graves on special occasions to spend some time in quiet reflection about the lives they might have been living if they were still alive. But as some time passed, Katie began to brighten up again, and her big smile and open heart returned. Her mother, Liz, said that Katie didn't make friends, she took hostages, and she'd never leave a room without a hug and an "I love you." Katie graduated from high school and began attending college at nearby Oswego College. Right after completing her first year, Katie went back home to hang out with some friends, especially her best friend from college, 19-year-old Cheryl Thayer, who was leaving the next day to move to California. On the evening of June 11th, 1999, the two girls were with three other friends, all guys, two of them who were over the age of 21. And even though both Katie and Cheryl were only 19, they'd had some drinks at a bar outside of Cortland. Cheryl Thayer would later say, quote, "Katie and I were refused service because of our age, so we both just drank out of our friends' drinks. We left around 2 o'clock in the morning. When we got to the car, I could feel alcohol in my system, so I called shotgun. And Katie would never drive, if she's even had one sip of a drink. I told the three guys we were taking home that one of them should drive, but all the guys said they were too wasted. So that's how I ended up behind the wheel, even though I'm from Ithaca, and I didn't know the roads. Also, the seating arrangement was weird. Katie was sitting in the seat behind me. The guy in the middle was huge. Normally, Katie would have been in the middle. I was driving her home first. She told me to take the back roads because they were quicker. I had no idea where we were going. I didn't know the roads. I didn't see the sign. It's 2:30 in the morning. The roads are deserted, and here comes this truck out of nowhere." End quote. Cheryl Thayer, whose blood alcohol was far over the legal limit, she failed to stop at an intersection, and the 1990 Chevy Corsica that she was driving was struck by another vehicle and propelled forward, where it became wedged underneath a tractor-trailer that was driving southbound on McLean Road. And then the car burst into flames. Katie Savina was the only one who did not make it out alive. Remembering this moment, Cheryl Thayer was unable to stop the tears from streaming down her face, and she said, quote, "There were flames. My door was wedged closed. The truck driver pulled me out. The moment I was taken out of the car, it exploded." End quote. 19-year-old Cheryl Thayer was arrested and charged with homicide, driving while intoxicated, and vehicular manslaughter. She could have faced 10 years in prison, but Katie's parents, Liz and Jim Savino, they worked with the Cortland district attorney, asking that the young girl only spend 6 months in prison and then 5 years of probation. Liz Savino said, quote, "I tried to do what Katie would have wanted. Katie was a true, loyal friend. My way of handling my daughter's death is to live the legacy she would have wanted, to try to open myself up to others and be less judgmental. I'm not certain I'm as successful as she was, but I'm certainly trying. I truly believe she is guiding me." End quote. 3 months after attending the memorial service of his friend and classmate, Katie Savino, 20-year-old Mike Vogt took a 12-gauge shotgun out into a little cabin in the woods that he had built with his childhood best friend, Johnny Lapinto, and Mike took his own life. He'd been teammates with Scott Pace. He'd known Billy Pace. He'd been coached by the football coach who had been murdered, and he'd been close to Sarah and Jennifer. He'd also loved Katie. And it's so chilling because I went through thousands of archived articles to do this series, specifically for this video, and Mike's name would sometimes pop up in them. He'd be commenting on the latest tragedy, the latest heartbreak, and you could tell he was getting more and more despondent each time, more hopeless. I guess that this is the benefit of hindsight. After the deaths of the Pace brothers and after the deaths of Sarah and Jennifer, there was a November 1996 article talking about how the football team was trying to cope and how they'd all retreated to the team room after learning about Scott Pace's death and how they did it again after hearing the news about Sarah and Jennifer. And this one paragraph caught my eye and it kind of broke my heart. It says, quote, "This is where we always seemed to end up," said Mike Vogt, a senior co-captain. "The Purple Lions sat in the tiny room Friday listening to I'm Not Happy, a mournful rock tune by a group called Sponge. They hung tokens of remembrance on leather cords around their necks, wooden coins with the initials of everyone who died." End quote. I mean, come on, this story that we're talking about right now, I kind of feel it's a little bit timely considering what has recently happened in Uvalde, Texas, and what's been happening more and more in schools around the United States. Childhood is fleeting already. It goes by much too fast, and it takes with it the benefit of being innocent and naive, the ability that a young person has to think that the world is this great place and that the people in it are mostly good. It's truly a treasure, those years of ignorant bliss, and everyone deserves to have them, to keep those memories of innocence, safe and sound. No kid should ever have to go through all of this, go through losing so many people. They shouldn't have to struggle to make sense of the senseless. But these kids in Dryden went through it over and over again, and it was a lot. and it was too much for Mike. And I feel like it would have been too much for me as well, especially at that age, at that time in my life where you're sort of just starting to grapple with feelings of morality and the understanding that, one day you're going to die, and one day everybody you love is going to die, and one day everybody you're looking at is going to die. It's like a lot. It's a lot for a young mind to handle. And this is what I was attempting to say when we began this series. Is there something eye-catching about a small town, the picture of simplicity and safety, experiencing a decade of absolute chaos? Of course, we're only human. We're drawn to patterns. We're drawn to things that seem truly unbelievable, things that we could never imagine going through. But given the fact that we didn't live through this, we have the luxury of thinking it's unbelievable. It could never happen to us. The people of Dryden, they didn't get to do that. They had to believe it. They had to face it. And it wasn't a curse or the work of some satanic presence. It was a series of unfortunate events that changed the course of people's lives forever. So my love and support goes out to the people who were affected, to the people of Dryden, to the people of the surrounding communities. You may not trust me. You may think of me as like a reporter or a journalist. I'm not. You may not trust anyone with your stories or with the memories of your loved ones. But I hope that we can all in this world regain a bit of that childhood innocence where we thought that the world was a great place and that the people in it were mostly good. Because if we don't, if we continue down this path of being jaded and fearful and feeling that we can't trust anybody and feeling that everybody's out to hurt us, it doesn't bode well for the future. And I don't know about you guys, but I would like my kids to grow up in a world where they can walk outside and view a stranger as a friend and not as a potential enemy. Thank you guys so much for being here for this series. I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Share it if you think it's worth sharing. Subscribe if you haven't already. You'll find the links in the description box to Glasses USA and all the frames that I showed you in this video. You'll also find links to my social media handles on Twitter and Instagram, as well as a link to purchase my coffee brand that I started with my co-host on Crime Weekly podcast, Derek Levasseur. It's called Criminal Coffee. It's a very, very good coffee. The best coffee, if I do say so myself. So go ahead and order yours now because we are finally catching up with the orders and you should be getting your order within a week or so. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you to my Patreons for being here. Thank you guys for sticking with me through this series, understanding that we weren't going to try to sensationalize anything. We were going to try to talk about these people, what they went through, their lives, who they were, with the utmost sensitivity and compassion, knowing that they're real people and many of these people are still alive and still struggling with this today. So once again, my heart goes out to them, my thoughts, my prayers, all of that jazz. I'm heading off to CrimeCon in London this coming week, so there's going to be a little gap in content here, but if you head over to Crime Weekly, you will see that we have started the Brittany Drexel case over on Crime Weekly, and that's going to be a series, and there should be a couple episodes of that up on podcast platforms and on YouTube by the time you guys see this, or at least one will be up, but more will follow. Thank you guys so much for being here. Stay kind, stay beautiful, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery. They're coming back from the grave, calling out my name, better say I have Mary. Well, you don't know how deep it goes until it's getting you slowly. It's all you got to let it go. I got blood on the strings.